My name is Eamonn Leonard. I'm a biologist with Georgia DNR. I also work with a coastal nonprofit called Coastal Wildescapes. I was the recent chairman, and so we do a lot of work trying to promote the use of natives. So today I was going to talk to you about landscaping with coastal natives and hopefully convince you that it's a good idea. And part of that is that we're sort of creating small, fragmented, and hopefully less fragmented over time, native habitat in our backyard. So I just want to start with this first, why natives? A big reason, and a kind of a popular reason, is promoting pollinators. And I'll go a little bit more about what exactly pollinators are if you don't know. The biggest thing is providing wildlife habitat. So specifically birds, native plants provide a lot of nesting and cover, as well as forage and seed. And one thing about forage we don't think about is the insects that our native plants produce. So not just the hard seeds, but birds specifically need insects to feed their young. So when you're planting natives, you're kind of bringing a part of the whole natural life cycle back into your yard that was missing when it was developed. So we might not know all those connections, but you'll start seeing them as you bring natives back in, because the wildlife of our area obviously adapted to using them. So I put down aesthetics. I feel like natives give you more of a sense of place, that natives belong here or wherever you're living. And it kind of just seems to fit better than an exotic. They stick out less. They kind of just feel more part of the environment. They should be easier if you're choosing the right plant for the right spot. Related to that, you shouldn't be needing to use pesticides and fertilizers. A lot of time when people have a insect issue, it's best to really kind of figure out, what is that insect? Is it really a problem? Is it doing damage, or is it just existing and coexisting with the native plant? So that's part of the reduction in pesticide use, is kind of not grabbing the spray bottle at first, just kind of maybe understanding what is that insect and does it play a larger role in the landscape. Again, if you're, as long as you're not planting wetland plants, they should use less water. And a lot of this sort of concepts are wrapped up and tied up together really well in a book by Doug Tallamy called Bringing Nature Home. So I would recommend that if you're looking for something to read. He's also got a new initiative called, I think it's called Homegrown National Park, where he's getting people to put their native plant gardens on a map, with the idea that as we all garden with natives and bring nature home, bring these native species back home, we're creating a larger ecosystem as we knit these things together. And so he's willing to see all that on a map. I think it's a great idea. Increasing biodiversity, we're bringing the diversity of life back into our landscape. I think it's the right thing to do. And I think natives are the new exotics, because unfortunately natives are harder to get. So when you have a really cool native in your yard, your neighbors might be, oh, cool, what is that? Because they can't really go down to the big box stores and get it. So they're kind of a little more exclusive in that way. So I think maybe that's a selling point. All right, just want to talk a little bit more about pollinators. You probably know about butterflies and bees, but other things can be pollinators, like birds and bats, small mammals, flies, beetles, wasps, all those sorts of things. They all play a role. We might be freaked out about some of them, but all those different species are really beneficial for pollination. And there's different reasons why we care about pollination. It's what is needed to produce seed and provide for the next generation of the plant. But also in an economic sense, we get a lot of produce from it. A lot of things that we eat and drink come from a plant that needs to be pollinated. We hear a lot about the decline of honeybees. They're not native. They're still economically important, but we do have a couple of native species that are also in decline, that by gardening with natives, we're trying to support the declining native pollinators, including monarchs, which have had declines due to habitat loss and possibly weather pattern changes and things like that. Also, bumblebees, in the last few years, they've been showing some declines. Some of this information comes from a group called Pollinator Partnership, which is a great thing to look up if you want to look for some more information on pollinators. So with any selection of a plant, whether it's native or not, you really need to understand and put it in the right spot. So right plant, right spot. So you need to kind of take some time and look at your landscape, get a better understanding of what your soil moisture is, what kind of soils you have, silt, clay, sand, that kind of thing. What is your sun exposure, full sunshade, and especially on the coast, do you have any salinity exposure, either through salt spray or through the tidal flow every day, or saltwater inundation from a storm? Once you get those kind of things understood, I think it's a good idea to take a walk in nature. You can't often go to the big stores and really find everything laid out for you. So it's good to kind of find a reference place that's pretty close to your landscape. Maybe you can even understand what ecosystem used to be where your current house is, and try to find an example of that ecosystem nearby, and take a walk in that throughout the seasons. Do a little bit of detective work, looking at the native plants that you like that are there, and see if you can't find a resource that has those or sells those that you can bring home. So it's a little bit more work, but since we're looking for native plants, they're all around us. We just have to kind of find which ones are going to work for you. Another thing with natives, there's a lot of hurdles with natives sometimes, but you need to do a little bit more planning. And part of that is with seasonality of flowers. So unlike sort of your bedding plants like petunias that will bloom all the time, except for in frost periods, our natives have more discrete flowering periods. And sometimes you need to kind of chart that out and plant things that are going to take over from the last plant that just finished flowering. And then think about when some plants have interest when they're not flowering. So that'll kind of extend the sort of the appearance of the plant, or add aesthetic value to your garden. So a lot of native grasses, even if they're not flowering, they still have some nice structure. So I'm going to kind of talk about different plants during different seasons that'll give you some interesting flowers. Another hurdle is availability. Where are you going to get these things? That's one of the most difficult things. So the nonprofit that I work with, Coastal Wildscapes, for years we've been doing a spring and fall plant sale in Darien. Wherever you're living, you might have an ancillary group, maybe a native plant society. They're great resources to go to. You could start asking your local nurseries for natives. If we can showing there's a market for it, maybe they'll start adding that to their inventory. If you've got a green thumb and you like growing things from seed, you can look at some of the native seed sources and see if you can start growing some yourself. I would be careful though, wildflower mixes. You want to look at that list and make sure there isn't any sort of invasive annuals, or maybe they're not really native, because they put wildflower around a lot of things that really aren't native here. So you really kind of have to do your homework there. And if you have a friend who's got some property and you've got permission, you can work with them to collect seed, but I would do it responsibly. You don't want to over collect. You want that plant to have enough to provide for the next generation. I think a lot of garden clubs are really getting into native plant swaps. That's a great resource, just sharing plants with your neighbors. And you could join like-minded groups, like I mentioned, Coastal Wildscapes, but there's different chapters of the Georgia Native Plant Society. There's the Georgia Botanical Society, and these groups often have field trips and walks. And so you can sort of pick their brain about what plants you're seeing, because it is really kind of hard to know what it is you're seeing out there in the woods. They're not labeled, obviously. So spending time with those groups can really help. Okay. So here's some native plant resources. All this information is on the Coastal Wildscapes website under resources, native plant sources. The most local to us on the coast is Florabundance Gardens, and that's Deborah Shepard, and she's just north of Darien. She'll set up, or usually sets up kind of a time for people to come by. She's not open all the time, but she usually schedules appointments. And then there's some mail order places that do seeds, and then there's a place out of Florida called Mail Order Natives that will mail live plants. And the Georgia Native Plant Initiative is through the State Botanic Garden. They've got a great list of native plant resources. And they're kind of vetted so they know they're not wild collecting and they're doing things responsibly. There we go. So I was trying to get this flyer to pop up. So this is a good list of native plants. It's a PDF that's on the Coastal Wildcapes website that you can download. And it goes over a lot more plants that I'm going to talk about today. And it talks about sun, shade, soil moisture, all that kind of stuff. So look for that on our website. So with any plant, like right plant, right place, you still need to have some design elements that you take into account when you're doing this. A lot of times native plants get a bad rap because people think it's going to look weedy. And I think that all just goes back into how much design did you put in when you started the project. So like when you're in the woods, landscapes read well because you see a lot of massing. So grouping plants together in larger groups instead of little things all put in together. So I'm really just kind of saying, take cues from nature. Often things in odd numbers look better than even. You need things at different scales. So you need big things and small things and things at different heights in your landscape. It kind of needs to read like a billboard. So kind of take a step back and think about, is what I'm planting really going to make sense? Is it legible from a distance? That's part of you being successful with natives. And on the coast of Georgia, we've got a lot of factors that I think also are challenging, but also kind of tell us that we really should be using natives from our area because they are adapted to that. High temperatures, salt spray. Deer is a hard one. I'm not sure I'm going to solve that in this lecture today, but I can talk a little bit about that. And then these are the hardiness zones and heat zones of Georgia. And the reason I put these up is you can see the coast of Georgia on both these maps are sectioned off within one little area. So my thought here is that if you're going to grow something, it's probably best to grow something that's already adapted to that zone that you're currently living. You're likely to have more success. Okay, so now I'm going to go into some profiles of the different species. It's not going to be exhaustive, and hopefully it's not exhausting to go through all this, but I'm going to go from, this is a plant that can grow or bloom somewhat year-round. So this is dune sunflower. And dune sunflower, it's more of a Florida native. It grows in the dunes down there, but it works very well in Georgia, and we're pretty close. It's kind of a mounding perennial. It can spread out to about 6 feet. Full sun, sandy soils, really tough plant. The only thing it's not tough about is deer. Deer will definitely eat this plant. So if you have deer at all, I wouldn't bother. They're just gonna kill it. It's kind of a short-lived perennial. Sometimes it's an annual if you get a hard freeze, but it'll come up from seed really easily, and you can nip it or edit it out in areas where you don't want it. So this is a really tough one. Scarlet sage. So we've got a couple of native salvias. This one grows about 2 feet. We see this one in maritime forests, on barrier islands, in part sun, full sun to part shade, on sandy soils, pretty dry soils. You also see it in areas, or it does well in areas that have a lot of calcium in the soil. So if you've got a lot of shell, it seems to do well on those. It will get to a period where it seems to stop flowering. You might have to cut it back or deadhead it a little bit. It's in the mint family, so that should infer some deer resistance. And this one will also reseed quite a bit. So you might have to edit it out where you don't want it. And this one will, like the previous plant, will kind of bloom almost year round, as long as you don't get a hard frost. Hummingbirds love this one. I see hummingbirds on this plant a lot. So we have a lot of great native spring flowering trees. The first one I wanted to talk about was red buckeye. You can see in the photo has this really nice, attractive, I guess it's a panicle of tubular red flowers that are attractive to hummingbirds. It's a smaller tree, so it's great for a smaller landscape. It's not super fast growing, but maybe up to 15 feet. This is also one that I will see in the wild growing on shell middens. So it's kind of a part shade, full sun kind of tree. All right, this next one might not be applicable to or usable in everyone's landscape. I think it's a cool tree. It's called Hercules Club or toothache tree. If you chew on the leaves, it numbs your mouth. But I think it has a very architectural, kind of structural look to the stems that are these kind of warty appendages with thorns on it. So you might not like that in your landscape, but it's a great, interesting small tree. Pollinators love it. It just adds a lot of character. And this is one you see growing on causeway edges, in the dunes, in full sun, on marsh hammocks. It's a really tough plant. Eastern redbud, which should be flowering about now in coastal Georgia. And they're the kind of smaller tree, one of the first trees to flower, attracted to a lot of pollinators. The next tree, I don't see people planting very much, but I think they should.
Oh, it's pretty.
It's called two-winged silverbell. This one grows along the Altamaha River in kind of the understory, so it's more of a part shade type plant. There is one planted on St. Simon's Island, a couple miles or maybe a mile south of the turnabout near the stables. It's on the east side. It's a good sized tree. So I'll probably try to take some pictures of that one and post it on the Coastal Wildescapes Facebook page and maybe the location so people can kind of see an example of it. It's a great alternative to dogwoods that don't really do well in coastal Georgia. Dogwoods just kind of look sad usually, but this one should do quite well. All right, so we've got a few shrubs that I think would be great to use. The first one is Walter's viburnum. It kind of has a look of a boxwood, but it flowers. And there's various cultivars. The native is kind of more of an open shrub, but they've got a lot of dwarf ones that are a lot more compact and maybe better for the home landscape. Sun to part shade. With a lot of our evergreen shrubs, they're great places to provide cover for birds as they're trying to get away from a predator. So that's kind of good to have those mixed into the landscape. Snowbell. This is a little bit larger, not quite into the tree range, but it's a multi-stem shrub. And I've seen this one growing in a lot of different habitats in coastal Georgia, sandy soils to wet slopes. So it seems to be widely adaptable, mostly in sort of part shade, but it has these really pretty bell-shaped flowers that are hang down from all the branches in the spring, really attractive. So we do have a native dogwood that does well. It doesn't have the same flower as the flowering dogwood. It's more of these clusters of small white flowers, but it does have berries that are produced afterwards, which is great for birds that are flesh-eating birds. And this is, as the name implies, it grows maybe on edges of swamps, wetland forests, that kind of thing. And it's more of a part shade kind of understory kind of plant. So moving more into just the spring flowering. So one of the showstoppers that we have in coastal Georgia that's very tough is white wild indigo. It's very drought tolerant. It's a very long-lived perennial. It kind of looks like a lupin, if you know lupins. It grows a kind of tall with the flower spikes, maybe 3 to 4 feet. So you maybe want to plant farther back in the flowering border. And once it finishes flowering, the other plants you plant in front of it will take over the show. But when this thing is blooming, it really does kind of take the show. It's a larval host for several butterflies. The foliage has a nice blue-gray cast to it that's still attractive throughout the rest of the season. And then it gets these dark fruit on it, which are still an attractive characteristic. Coreopsis, we have several different coreopsis. There are some that bloom in the fall, and don't think I'm talking about those today, but this first one, lance leaf tickseed, you see this a lot on roadsides, and it should be starting to flower maybe after maybe late March. I think it's a great cut flower, great pollinator plant. It's very tough. Deer will eat it though, but usually when you have it, you have a lot of it, and so usually it can withstand a little bit of that. But sandy soils, the individual plant might not live for a very long time, maybe several years, but it does seed about. And so if you've got more of an area where you can allow that to happen, that'd be great. And this one grows kind of short, so it'd be more of a front of the border kind of thing, maybe 1 to 2 feet. As we move into summer, purple-head sneezeweed, I think is a great native. It grows a little bit higher than the coreopsis I was just talking about, so about 3 feet. So maybe step it back a little bit in the garden border. I guess back in the day, people really needed to sneeze, and so they would use dried powdered parts of this plant to do that. So if that's your thing, this is another one for you. And the foliage is supposed to be a little bit bitter. That's something you want to look for if you have issues with deers. Is it in the mint family, or does it have a bitter taste? And that can help infer some deer resistance. So this is a great one to pull into your landscape. It's named after Helen of Troy, I guess, when she, I don't know the full story. I think when she was crying or something, flowers popped up, and a plant in the same genus, Helenium, is what came up. So that's kind of a cool little part of the story. All right, another really great native plant staple is coral bean. Really nice, attractive, huge spikes of red tubular flowers that are attracted to hummingbirds, which are then followed by these bean pods that break open to show orange berries. So it's in the legume family. The seeds are poisonous. I don't know what the dosage is, how much of a threat that is, but and maybe not put this in a garden where you know you'd have someone trying to eat it. It's incredibly tough plant, deep sandy soils. You see this in a lot of the maritime forests around here, full sun to part shade. Upland pine forest, you see this plant as well. It's just a really tough plant. Throughout the summer, this plant will be flowering. You can deadhead it a little bit too to get it to rebloom. This is Indian blanket. You see a lot of people seeding roadsides with it. So I think a lot of the roadside plantings probably aren't from a local source. The leaves are a little bit hairy, so that does infer a little bit of deer resistance. But early in the season, this thing is first coming up, and this is kind of the thing with most deer-resistant plants also, is when they're still sort of greening up and they're not hardened off, they can still be attractive to deer. You kind of have to wait till the plants harden off and get really hairy, or whatever is the character that's making the deer resistant kind of manifest. But full sun, dry sandy soils, this is a great one. It's not, again, not one of the longest living plants, but it will reseed. This one is a very long-lived plant. It's kind of a different looking plant. It's got strappy leaves, kind of like a yucca or an iris. It won't poke you in the eye like the yucca as well, but it has these really interesting spherical clusters, very sculptural looking, the flowers. And even after it's flowering, they persist, and you still have that unique structure. I think it'd be a great cut flower. It's very attractive to pollinators, as you can see from these pictures. Dry, sandy soils, full sun. You can plant it a little bit farther back and have other things growing around it. I think it just adds a lot of interesting character. Later in the summer, spotted bee balm is our only native bee balm on the coast. You might have seen the other bee balms that are more these little puffs of pink flowers. This one has a different structure to the flower. It's almost like a tiered cake or something. And it has these kind of like airbrushed almost showy leaves right below the flowers. And each of the flowers are these tubular flowers with spots on them, hence the name spotted bee balm. Great pollinator plant. This one is a mint, so again, it has some deer resistance. With some of our natives, like this one, I tend to cut it back a little bit because it can get a little bit leggy. So I'll mention that with a few of them. But this one, I cut it back, maybe stopping in maybe May, and just let it bush out a little bit, give it a better structure, and kind of keep it a little bit smaller. But again, it'll reseed, and so you can remove it where you don't want it. But it's a really tough plant. It grows on forest edges, so part sun or full sun will be fine. Sandy soil, so really tough plant. New Jersey tea. This is a summer flowering shrub. It's another really dry, sandy soil, full sun. In a natural environment, it grows in upland pine forests on the coast, which naturally would burn. I don't know that y'all would really need that as a plus for this one, but it will survive burning. It has a really big taproot that it establishes, so it kind of takes a little bit for it to establish. If you need some soil stabilization, or maybe for a slope, this is a good one because of that root system. It had a lot of cultural uses. I won't go through a lot of those, but it was a tea substitute. different parts of the plant you could use to make a dye. And then the flowers had saponin in them. So if you crush them in soapy water, you're supposed to be able to get some suds from it. So if you want more information about that kind of stuff, there's some great herbal websites that talk about the different uses of New Jersey tea beyond it being a great kind of small mounding shrub for the native plant landscape. So we're going to move into fall. So this is our other native salvia or sage. This is Salvia azurea blue sage. It grows quite a bit taller than the first one, and it, like the first one I talked about, scarlet sage can bloom during a long period. This one has a more of a discrete flowering period, September through November. This one we find in maritime forests, kind of in forest gaps, so part shade, full sun, sandy soils. It's in the mint family, so again, shouldn't be favored by deer. And this is another one that I will prune back a little bit in early summer to get it to bush out. You don't want to keep pruning very late into the summer or you won't get flowers, but pruning it a little bit early on will get it the ability to bush out a little bit. Another great fall flower is blazing star. We've got several different species. They have a little bulb that they grow out of, so it gives them some really long-lived perennial potential. Sandy soils, they're drought tolerant. There's just a lot of different species. Just kind of a really cool linear look to it. Great thing to put back in the border when the rest of the year it's not doing much, and just let fall be when it does its show. Goldenrods sometimes get a bad rap, mainly because of the misconception that you're allergic to goldenrod, but it really is usually because of ragweed that's flowering at the same time. But ragweed doesn't have a showy flower, and it gets blamed on the thing that has the showy flower. The one I'm talking about here is seaside goldenrod. This one grows in the dunes, edges of salt marsh. So it has salt spray resistance. I've seen that with some of our hurricanes, where other things we planted, the salt sprays knocked those things back, but this plant didn't even seem affected. So if you've got that sort of situation in your landscape, this would be a great one to try. This is another one that I prune back to give it more of a bushy habit. I think a lot of times in nature, the environments are maybe a little more stressful, and so that helps keep things smaller, but also they're growing with other plants that kind of give them a structure to make them less floppy and leggy. And this one's not supposed to be favored by deer. I haven't tested that. You probably all know American beautyberry. It's a nice shrub that we find in maritime forests, inland forests, and part shade. It really comes to be really attractive in the fall when the purple berries come on, and then they persist into the winter after the leaves have fallen. It does have spring flowers, which are great for pollinators, but they're not really showy for us. There are a variety of uses. People will use it to do like an insect repellent. I had someone give me a candle they made out of it. I haven't used it yet, but that's kind of a cool thing to do, is to try to use our native plants, some of their cultural uses. So the berries obviously are really attractive to birds. The deer will browse it, but maybe that's okay. It keeps the shrub in check. So we've got a lot of great native grasses that just adds another structural element to the landscape. I really like native grasses to be clumped and grouped in masses. The first one I'm talking about is little blue stem. This is one that we find growing in deeper sandy soils. It has that bluish green cast to it. It's a clumping grass, so it's not going to spread. So you need to plant the amount of plants you want there. I just think it's a really neat looking plant. River oats. This one obviously grows near wetlands. We find this on the coast in freshwater wetlands. It looks kind of like our sea oats, and it is closely related, but it's a lot shorter, maybe about 3 feet. It will seed out a little bit, so if that is a problem for you, you might have to remove the seeds before they become ripe. I think it's a great cut flower, a great thing to bring into the house. Everyone knows about pink muley. I think it's very popular, widely available in the nursery trade. So that another clumping grass, and it just kind of has a really great show in the fall of these sort of cloudy masses of pinky purple flowers. Switchgrass is another great native grass. It's a clumper. It's another fall flowering grass. Another great one to think about using in the landscape. And the last one is purple love grass, kind of like the pink muley, but it's a lot shorter. Doesn't really do a whole lot. It's not very showy in the rest of the year, but once it flowers in the fall, another cloudy poof of purple flowers. This one's also great for ground nesting birds because it creates this that little mound of foliage. So it's good to not clean up our native plant gardens too early, because there's a lot of things that are using them throughout the winter for nesting or just to sort of make it through the winter. So I usually suggest people wait till March, about now, to really clean up your garden, because there's things that use the stems, bees, and moths that overwinter and butterflies that overwinter. So it's best to kind of treat your native plant garden as nature would in the forest, is to let it sit and rest. And if you designed it well, it'll still be attractive throughout the winter. You can clean off your pathways just to make your neighbors know that you're not completely neglecting your yard, but it's important to leave these kind of things for cover throughout the winter. Okay, I'm just going to go over a few fall color trees. Unfortunately, we have a tree on the coast called Chinese tallow or popcorn tree. It has great fall color, but it's incredibly invasive. And so a lot of times I talk to people about getting rid of Chinese tallow, but you want to give them something that will give them the characteristics that they liked. And one of those is fall color. So we've got red maples that grow in wetlands on the coast. It's a shorter lived tree, but it's great for fall color. There are some cultivars. The flowers are attractive to hummingbirds.
Inches.
Another really great one is black tupelo. If you're a beekeeper, you've probably heard of tupelo honey. These are the trees you need to be able to get tupelo honey. It's a native tree to the coast. There's several different ones that grow in different moisture environments. This one is the upland Nissasalvatica. It's also called black gum. You might have heard that name, but really great fall color. So we can't really grow the standard northern sugar maple in coastal Georgia, but we can grow Florida sugar maple, and it is found naturally in some pockets in coastal Georgia. I think I've seen it in Effingham County. It's a much smaller tree than the sugar maple, which is good for smaller landscapes, about 25 feet tall. It has more of a yellow fall color. I've seen it tinge into orange. It's a really attractive tree. Another one that's really widespread that I don't know people landscape much with, but I think they should, is persimmon. I've seen it grow in really deep sandy soils, has great fall color. Sometimes it's almost like a bronze color, really adaptable. And then the fruit that it produces are coveted by wildlife. I've never been able to eat the fruit in the wild because it's always taken by wildlife. So that's another great added benefit. So winter, we do have some things in winter interest beyond letting the things out there like the grasses stay present and have their structure. We've got witch hazel. And I think I took this bottom right picture in December this past year. So late fall, early winter. There are cultivars of this that kind of maximize on the flower, make them a little bit bigger. But we find this in really dry upland sites, part shade. And it also has some cultural uses to make astringents for like skin cleansing, that kind of thing. I also like to talk about some native flowering vines that are good alternatives to some of the more invasive things that people tend to grow, like the non-native wisteria and Japanese honeysuckle and things like that. So we've got a native honeysuckle that's really pretty, has tubular red flowers. It's somewhat evergreen. This year mine had already defoliated, so but it has really attractive blue gray foliage. It's supposed to be deer resistant. Carolina jessamine's an evergreen vine that should be flowering about now. It's also supposed to be deer resistant. You can trim this back pretty hard. It's very flexible. You might even be able to use this as a ground cover in the shade if you keep it down. It's just a really tough native plant. Later in the summer, you get butterfly pea. This is a native legume, really attractive flower, very showy, and these long pea pods, but just a great butterfly plant. This one we see in maritime forests on the Barrier Islands, upland pine forest inland. So it's pretty widespread. This is probably one where you probably had to find a seed pod and grow it from seed. You don't see this one sold too much, but it should. Climbing aster, this is one you do see sold sometimes by native plant nurseries. On the coast of Georgia, we find it growing on edges of wetlands, but it would grow well in a normal garden soil. It's not really a vine, it's just an aster that is really big and bushy. And with all of these native vines, they have different periods of flowering. And so you could almost grow them on the same fence row or on the same trellis, and they would take over for each other throughout the season. It's a great way to stagger them. Got a couple more native vines. Like I mentioned, we don't want people growing the non-native wisteria. We do have a native wisteria, which in the wilds you might find growing on the edges of the Satilla River or the Altamaha River, wetland edges. One way you can tell it from the non-native is they flower with the foliage. So it flowers a little bit later in the season, maybe June, late May. And then the seed pods on the native don't have any hairs on them. The exotic, you've probably seen the bean pods are very hairy. The native ones don't have any hairs on the pods, but there are some cultivars available in the nursery trade. So it's actually one that you can find. You just want to check the label carefully and make sure you're not taking home the exotic. Virgin's Bower is one of our native clematises. There is an exotic clematis called Sweet Autumn Clematis. The one way you tell that apart, they both flower kind of in the summer, but this one, the native has little teeth on the lobes of the leaf. The non-native, the lobes are very smooth. I see a lot of the non-native growing in downtown Brunswick in abandoned lots and that kind of thing. So just be careful which one you're picking, but it's a great sort of summer, late summer flower. So you've seen on the labels a lot of these less aggressive than the invasive version, the non-native version. This next one, Passion Vine, is actually quite aggressive. So you probably isn't adaptable for most landscapes unless you grow it in a pot where you can kind of keep it in check, or you've got maybe a wild place in the back where you can allow it to kind of do its thing. But it's a great host plant for butterflies. This is a picture of the fritillary and its caterpillar. It'll almost defoliate the plant, so great host material. Flowers are attractive to pollinators, and then the fruit are attractive to birds. This one we naturally find growing in the dunes or sandy uplands. You see it on disturbed roadsides. So it's found in a lot of different habitats in coastal Georgia. So, and I just want to talk about a few of our native hibiscus, mainly because hibiscus are popular in the horticulture trade. And I just want to let you know there are some native hibiscus. A lot of them are native to wetter soils, but some are adaptable. Some are tolerant of saltwater or saltwater spray. They are unfortunately very deer favored. They're like ice cream. But you can maybe even plant one of these in a pot and keep it more moist if you really like one of these, if you don't have a wetland situation. But this first one is called giant rose hibiscus. This one grows on barrier islands and freshwater wetlands. Jekyll has a great area that has them on the south end. They're kind of maybe a spring to early summer flower. Their foliage is very fuzzy, so that gives it a lot of interest. It grows quite a bit tall, so about 6 feet. And then even in the winter, the naked stems with the seed pods, I think, are still attractive. So it has a lot of interest. And all of these hummingbirds are attracted to, and other pollinators. This is pineland hibiscus or comfort root. You might have seen this one on roadsides, maybe edges of wetlands, or into like a pineland flatwoods. Has rough leaves, kind of like a cat's tongue, white flowers with a red center. This one's a little bit shorter, about 3 feet. So this one is pretty adaptable to dry to moist soil. Swamp rose mallow, this one's more of a pink to dark pink with a reddish center. And it's usually found in freshwater ditches. This one I probably wouldn't put in too much of a dry soil. This one's about 3 to 5 feet. This one I've never seen on the coast of Georgia, but it's widely available in the horticulture trade. This is scarlet rose mallow. Most people know this one. The leaves kind of look like marijuana, so if you want to freak out your neighbor, you can plant this one. Grows about 6 feet tall. And this one is a really great one if you've got salt. This one is seashore mallow. It grows on edges of wetlands, of salt marsh, but it also will grow in normal garden soil. It's a lot smaller. It's about 3 to 5 feet, and it's more branchy than the others. and the flowers are smaller, they're about 2 inches, where the others are maybe like a tea saucer size or dinner plate size. This one's a lot smaller, but it produces a lot more flowers. It's a fun one to use. Okay, so I also like to talk about native plants for hedging. That's something that people need plants for. The first one I was going to talk about is devilwood osmanthus. It's an evergreen. It's more of a tree, but I think it will do well as a hedge. It's related to olive. You might know the horticultural one that people plant on the coast, fragrant tea olive. So it has the same genus as that, osmanthus. This one grows in upland, dry, sandy soils. It's kind of an understory tree. If you don't want to use it as a hedge, you can use it as a small tree. It's a great native evergreen tree. Yopon holly is very adaptable. There are several cultivars. There's dwarf, there's weeping, then there's the standard. It's great for cover for birds. Also, the fruits are attractive to birds. This is a picture in the top right of Althama plantation. This is the 1930s era formal garden on a property that we acquired in 2015, and we've been restoring that. And so that's Yopon that we have to hedge back, but it does well in that setting. We actually have a native privet, so I don't really encourage people to plant any of the non-native ligustrums, but this is a native privet with the genus Forestiera. It's found on shell middens naturally. It looks like a boxwood. It's semi-evergreen. Usually it has sort of a yellowish winter color. It's kind of like fall color, but it happens in the winter. There's a lot on the Jekyll Causeway, so you might see it there. But you can leave it natural, limit up as a kind of a
we'll go get
small tree, or you can keep it hedged as a more formal setting. This is a plant that you've probably seen a lot. It's available on the horticulture trade. Yellow anise. The leaves are fragrant when you crush them. More of a Florida native. I don't see it too much in Georgia, but a great, large, dense evergreen shrub. It might be too large for some garden settings. You can get 15 to 20 feet without. So it's good to know the maximum size, because you don't want to be out there pruning all the time and cursing your selection. So if you need something for a large hedge, this is a great one to try. Okay, I think I rushed through that, but let me pull up the chat. And if you've got any questions, I'll give you some time to write those in, but I'll see what we've got already and see what we can address. Okay, Gail, Celia. So scarlet sage blooms year-round at her home in St. Mary's. She has lots of carpenter bees and butterfly bees and small bees that have just come out and are foraging on the scarlet sage. So that's one of the only things that's blooming in her yard. Donna said her passion flowers are consumed completely by caterpillars, so they're not a problem. So it sounds like the passion vine is kept under control in her yard by the caterpillars. And I've heard other people say theirs get completely consumed. All right, I'll let y'all have any more questions. Nothing's popping up yet. I'll give you all a couple more minutes. Or a couple more seconds, actually. Okay, doesn't look like y'all have any more questions. Oh, no, they all came in just now. All right. Do you fertilize these plants at all? So it depends. I think for establishment, you could do a little bit in the root zone, but I tend not to. You're definitely going to need to water these things till they're established. You can't. We always say native plants are low maintenance, but you still have to get them established. So usually the first year you need to just to make sure they're established. Keep them watered until they're rooted, depending on the plant. I guess personally, I just tend not to fertilize that much. Are there any native ground covers for shade? So that's a good question that I get a lot. I didn't talk about it today, but there's a plant called partridge berry. I'll type in the scientific name, Michella repens. That's I find in shady areas. It tends to be in shady areas that are moist. I'm going to type in another plant, Smilax pumila. which is also called sarsaparilla vine. It grows in sandy soils, shady, it has a mottled leaf. It's related to the catbrier, which are horrible in the garden, but it doesn't have thorns, or it has minimal thorns, and it has really nice clusters of kind of shiny red berries. There are some native grasses that are good for the shade. They're called wood oats. I'll type that in the chat. Casmantium laxum and Casmantium sessiliflorum. Might have to correct my spelling. Those we find in the shade in maritime forests. You could also, like I said, try to get the Carolina jessamine to be a ground cover. I've not tried it. So Gail put in the chat about a book on native plants for semi-shade. I should look that up. It's easier, unfortunately, to do a lot of things in the sun. There's a lot more plants that do really well in the sun for ground covers. I think mulch is fine. I mean, it's really best under trees not to have a lot of grass, like turf grass. It's a lot of competition for those surface roots for trees. So mulching out so the drip line. And I would recommend shouldn't have to bring in a lot of mulch. You should leave the leaves there because the tree is giving itself what it needs. So the book I talked about at the beginning is from Doug, I'll type that in, Doug Tallamy, called Bringing Nature Home. And the other initiative he had is Homegrown National Park. All right, how about lyre leaf sage as a ground cover? I think it's great to leave some of that. It comes up in our lawns a lot. I mean, it's a little clumper. I don't know if it would make a complete cover, but if you kept leaving it and maybe taking things that are competing, I think it could close in and make a ground cover. I think what else would be yeah. All right, any more questions? The frog fruit, I keep thinking about frog fruit. That's a great one. So you see frog fruit a lot on the edges of roads on Jekyll, sandy soils. It's also called matchstick head because each little flower looks like a little matchstick. I think it's Phyla nodiflora. I put the scientific name in the chat. I don't know that you'd be able to buy that one anywhere, but yeah. And Georgia basil, Ginger talked about Georgia basil. That's a great one. That one does better part shade, full sun. Georgia basil or Dune rosemary. Those are both sort of mounding evergreens. They have a flower like rosemary does, and they flower in the cool seasons. That's actually what there's a picture of right here that I didn't even talk about it on the bottom left corner. Y'all have any other ideas on ground cover? All right, well, yeah, mimosa is really good for sun. Mimosa strigulosa, or I don't know if people still call it sensitive briar, but it's one where you touch the leaves and they'll kind of close up. It will definitely dominate a site. We've got some planted at the DNR native plant garden. So if you want to come by, look at some native plant gardens, there's a plant garden at DNR. There's also one at the UGA Marine Extension Bay Street, downtown Brunswick. The formal garden at Altama, I've been trying to get a lot of natives in there. And then K Creek Wetlands at exit 76 has a boardwalk. And there's some areas where we've done some native demonstration gardens, but also it's a good place to look at native plants, and there's a lot of signage, so that would help with identification. And Gail talked about white clover. Yeah, I just mentioned the Marine Extension Native Plant Garden. And then there's the Woodbine Boardwalk, has great signage, so there's some information on that. The Wally Preserve is getting some new signage soon on St. Simon's near the stable, so that should have some good native plant, or at least wildlife habitat information. And again, it's helpful to join like-minded groups and ask each other what things are and what works for each other. A lot of it's kind of sharing knowledge and success and what worked for them. Okay. All right, I think I'm going to end it there. I'm sure you also have questions, but hopefully I see you all sometime in person. I guess feel free to email me. I know